Good afternoon and welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. I'm Sushma Raman, the Executive Director at the Center, and it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you today to today's conversation with Ming Francis. Dr. Francis is an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington, and she was previously a Visiting Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's currently a fellow at the Carr Center, and we're so honored and delighted to work in collaboration with her. She was the founding co-director of the Race and Capitalism Project and a former research fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She specializes in the study of American politics with broad interests in criminal punishment, Black political activism, philanthropy, and the post-Civil War South. She's the author of the award-winning book, Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State. At the Carr Center, she's been working on her next book project, How to Fund a Movement, which examines the history and future of philanthropy's complicated relationship with social movements. I'm going to turn it over to Megan now for her presentation, and then we're going to have an opportunity to engage in conversation with her. Thank you, Megan.
Thanks. It's really, really great to be here. I chuckled during the intro when you said complicated, because that's probably a very generous version or like way to talk about the relationship between philanthropy and social movements. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to warn the audience that I always every now and then have a technical difficulty, so just bear with me. Okay, let me change these things. All right, great. So first off, I want to start off by thanking Sushma Raman and Matthias Reese and the rest of the wonderful people at the Carr Center for all the important work that you do. And to all of you who are out there, I'm grateful for y'all for taking time out of your day and spending it with me this afternoon. So the presentation and what I'm going to talk about, and this is going to be kind of informally and a little bit formal because I have a presentation, but I do want you to treat it as informally, as a discussion with the title Protest and Promises. And I'm going to talk about a bit of historical work around the Black freedom movement, especially around the fight around racial violence. I'm also going to talk more about a little bit about the contemporary movement. And I also want to think about that inside of the confines of philanthropy. So we're going to be kind of doing a lot of work here. And I'm really curious if you have any questions in the Q&A. So we're going to hold all of those things with us. Again, historical Black freedom struggle, contemporary struggle, as well as philanthropy. All right. Okay, so I want to acknowledge the anxiety of the moment that we're all in right now. It's month 2021 of the pandemic. Our worlds have changed. There is a lot of anxiety in this moment about things we seemingly have no control over and about things we do. COVID is still rampant, police are still killing, and our election system is in crisis. And as we saw on Tuesday, still has surprises for us. Today, a good portion of the country seems perfectly fine with a violent white supremacist insurrection of January 6th, and they want to move past it. Nothing to see here. This is definitely the message right now from members of the Republican Party in Congress. We're living through very, very strange times. It strikes me that the thing people have been fighting against the most right now, as well in the past, is violence. More precisely, the structuring role of violence in American society. Today, we have the audacity to act surprised that a country founded on the plunder of Native nations and built by the labor of enslaved Black people is still violent and racist, right? We can and should understand how these foundational moments have structured everything else, and then we should do something about them, take action to help right the wrong. So the central question that I find myself landing on and returning to, especially over the last 2 years, is who do I want to be as an individual and who do we want to be as a country? It's a futuristic type of question. I think it calls us to think beyond the here and now. Want, who do we want, implies that I am not, and we are not the greatest versions of ourselves. But it also suggests that the process of becoming the final form of who we can be is not yet over. And I choose to focus on who do we want to be, because who we have become is clearly untenable. The past 2 years have showed us who we are, a nation with a massively unequal healthcare system, a racist and violent police force, and a criminal justice system that is anything but just. Millions of Americans who teeter on the edge of food and housing insecurity and rising levels of authoritarianism. So the past 19 months or 20 months or 21 months, I've lost count, have been all those things. And yet, the events have also showed us that another world is possible. People have come together in ways that I couldn't even have imagined just 2 years ago. Mutual aid for their communities, our public health professionals risking their lives to save ours. In solidarity in the form of righteous indignation and marches against institutional racism. Together, people across this nation, poor and wealthy, non-citizen and citizen, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, AAPI, and white, have started to build a new world. The present may not be the world they want, but it's clear that people still got a lot of fight in them for something radically different. But how do we do it? Now, this is the big, right? This is the big important question, the do part. And I think that there are many answers that all revolve around organized protest. It strikes me that this is what protest is about, the doing part of creating a better world. And so what I want to focus on in the rest of my talk today is organized protest around the issue of racial violence. Building a different world where people not only feel valued, but safe requires that we center and address not just the present, but the past about how this country has used racial violence, how it operates through people, private individuals, as well as public officials, and institutions, again, both public and private, and how people have mobilized against it. This is what I know for sure, that we cannot build the world we want if we do not address and do something right now about racial violence. So I'm going to reflect upon the last 2 years to help kind of diagnose the problem, and then use a historical focus on the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in the early 20th century to help kind of show a way or a path forward. The problems that we see today did not begin with COVID-19, nor did they begin in May with the murder of George Floyd of May of last year. They didn't even begin with Trump, right, in 2016, or with the Tea Party many years before. And I always am like, let me just say this a little bit more explicitly, that all the problems that were laid bare so clearly in 2020 were around before 2020. It's just that many people chose not to see them, right? And I'm using chose here because they were there before. We are a nation that has been running from its history and its present. Every time a politician said and or is saying, right, post-Tuesday, that this is not who we are, a chorus of people, mostly people of color, shouted back, this is who we always were. The great African-American sociologist, W.B. Du Bois, tells us, quote, a system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect, end quote. The system as it currently operates does not provide justice and safety, nor does it treat people equally because it was never meant to. But that doesn't mean that has to always be the case. COVID-19 didn't just reveal deep health disparities, it stopped people from running from the truth, literally. And I've said in a previous Carr webinar that like part of, I think, what made the 2020 moment different is I think was in part because everybody was inside, and the ways in which that so many people tend to run from issues about racism, they couldn't run anymore, and it confronted them. That they could not kind of go to the brunches, they could not turn into extracurricular activities, that they were faced with the fact of what was going on in this country, and they had to confront it in a way they never did before. The murder of George Floyd was not the first time an innocent Black person has been killed by police. There was Breonna Taylor last March, Stephon Clark, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile pulled over for a traffic stop in 2016, Alton Sterling for selling CDs and DVDs in Louisiana, and of course, Eric Gardner in 2014, who died in a chokehold saying, I can't breathe 11 times, and so many more. The most recent data collected by the organization Mapping Police Violence reveals that Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. There is a crisis of enormous proportions in the areas of policing and incarceration in the United States. The history of racialized policing in this country is long. In my research, I tell this story in terms of that doesn't just begin in the 70s and 80s, as so much important scholarship has showed us that kind of the growth of especially mass incarceration, but really in terms of, especially in the South, where we see the writing of new criminal laws and a racialized type of policing happens at the end of the Civil War, throughout the period of Reconstruction, and then very much ramps up after Reconstruction is over, right? And so you have, and this is some of the work of a number of well-noted historians who focus on this period of convict leasing in the American South. You have certain states in the American South, such as Louisiana and Mississippi, in which the prison population immediately expands in the aftermath of the Civil War, and the majority of their population is Black people. So meditate on this for a moment, that a group of Americans encounter a vastly different police force than others and pay the ultimate price through death, not just in 2020, but over the long durée of American history. Black people have shown that racism is deadly for generations. They have said this. And it wasn't until a global pandemic pushed everyone indoors and shut down all of the activities that a much wider population of Americans came to learn more, were outraged, and committed themselves to making change and becoming anti-racist for some and abolitionist for others. I may be critical about how long it took a majority of Americans to get here, but I am thankful that many have arrived. Unsatisfied with who we have become, families, communities, small towns ask the question, who do we want to be? And we need to know who we want to be so that we also know what we are fighting for, and fight people did. For nearly 3 straight months during the spring and summer of 2020, thousands of protests and rebellions exploded across the country. More than 20 million, there's some estimates that put the number at 26 million, people of all races from large cities to rural locales have marched and protested in a defiant display of public mourning and righteous rage, demanding accountability for the brazen murder of countless Black people at the hands of law enforcement. Now their voices, their bodies, and their imaginations have awakened a sleepy nation to the urgency of addressing deeply entrenched racial injustice. Now, of course, some of you also know that public opinion, at least in 2020, we can talk about 2021 in Q&A, but in 2020 confirmed the shift, noting in June and July of 2020 that public opinion had shifted dramatically in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. Polling data indicated that a, quote, majority of Americans believe that the police are more likely to use deadly force against African Americans, and that there's also a lot of discrimination against Black Americans in society. The shift in public opinion felt surreal. Now let's remember that in 2014, many white Americans thought it acceptable to debate the phrase Black Lives Matter. It was a question in a lecture that I gave in 2017. Now, fast forward to the present, in 2020, as well as now, where members of Congress and police officers took a knee, raised a fist, and proclaimed Black Lives Matter, where corporations also displayed their solidarity with Black Lives Matter. Protests centered around the protection of Black lives in so many ways brought this nation to its knees. For millions of Americans, the 2020 protests came as a surprise, but they are not. The current transformative moment is built on the legacies and work of previous Black protest movements. Now, we don't get a BLM or Movement for Black Lives kind of 2020 without protests after Zimmerman's acquittal for killing Trayvon Martin in 2012, or the Ferguson uprising or Baltimore BLM protests. But it goes back even further than the 21st century establishment of the Movement for Black Lives. The long Black freedom struggle developed the political language, it developed the strategies and organizing infrastructure that has culminated in the present moment. Examining this longer lineage of Black protest movements is critical in helping all of us understand how we arrived, where we are going, the timeline of struggle, and the urgent need to move forward with boldness in the future. So I don't ever talk about movements and or the current movement around racial violence without talking about Ida B. Wells. In general, the American public knows very little about the long tradition of Black Lives Matter protests. So in 1900, the civil rights icon Ida B. Wells, who was doing work before 1900, but there's an important quote that comes out of 1900, spoke at a gathering in Chicago and delivered a stinging indictment. She said, quote, "Our country's national crime is lynching," end quote. Now, Wells would know best. The end of the 19th century marked the highest number of lynchings of Black people in the United States. In response, Wells spearheaded a dramatic public education campaign around lynchings, whereby she collected data and wrote numerous news stories to raise awareness about what was being done to innocent Black people. At the time, lynchings of Black people were justified by a widespread belief in the innate criminality of Black people. Now, what Wells did through her investigations is she told another story, that lynchings were a tool of white supremacy to maintain the total economic, educational, social subordination of the Black community. By conducting lynching investigations and writing news stories, Wells provided a mirror to white America to examine itself. And for Black protests, Wells left the enduring lesson to always question state justifications for Black death. Before the NAACP focused on their historic battle against segregated education, the organization spent 2 decades in the early 20th century exposing the dangerous levels of racial violence endured by Black people, by police officers, politicians, and private white citizens. The second picture here with the flag, I think, is probably familiar. It's been passed around on social media a lot over the last few years, but it is a picture of a flag that the NAACP used to fly outside of their offices in New York City as a reminder to the good people in the North that like terrible things were happening in other parts of the country as well as in the North, and that they should pay attention. Now, I chronicle the NAACP's campaign around racial violence in my first book, Civil Rights in the Making of the Modern American State. The book is trying to make a claim about how Black citizens constructed civil rights in American politics in the darkest of times, before the landmark Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision at the height of lynchings, abandoned by both national parties, and decades before the student sit-ins and the heyday of civil rights activism. How did the NAACP organize in a political environment that did not treat Black people as complete citizens? Now, in order to fight this racist violence, the NAACP organized mass demonstrations. They lobbied Congress to pass a federal anti-lynching bill and petitioned 3 different presidents to speak about the violence that Black people were enduring. The most extraordinary achievement, and this is kind of a big focus of actually my book, was the Supreme Court decision Moore v. Dempsey. It was a landmark criminal procedure case decided by the Supreme Court in 1923. The NAACP investigated the case. They provided and funded the legal defense as well as the investigations associated with it. They then litigated the case up into the Supreme Court. And it's this really, really important case in which the Supreme Court actually, this is their first time in which they get involved in state criminal court trials. And so, but together in terms of the legal part, the work around the legislation, as well as the work in the executive branch and their work around public opinion, it was this massive, extraordinary, in-your-face campaign at the NAACP waged in the first quarter of the 20th century that forced America to confront lynching and mob violence. And it asked America, how strong was its commitment to protecting Black lives? Now, kind of sometimes the questions that I get is like, what about these other issues that we now associate with civil rights, such as housing, voting, and education? These issues were important, but it wasn't the NAACP's top concern at the beginning of the organization's existence. There is this great, I think a powerful exchange that happens in one of the board meeting minutes when somebody who is white and on the NAACP's board asks a question like, hey, why aren't we focusing on these other issues? One of the Black board members responds, and this is a quote, all the Negro wanted was a chance to live without a rope around his neck, end quote. And this is the idea, right? That the protection of Black lives if that was not secured, then everything else would mean very little, that this was the most important thing for Black people at the time. Now, as a result of the NAACP's organizing in the first quarter of the 20th century, the rates of lynching and mob violence dramatically decreased. And after Moore v. Dempsey, federal courts intervened in numerous cases to protect the lives of Black defendants from police brutality. Much research in my field, discipline political science, looks to institutions and elite actors in government to explain dramatic shifts in political and constitutional development. Now, the NAACP's movement against racist violence tells us a different story. It suggests that bottom-up protests can meaningfully change the actions taken by political institutions and make government more accountable to citizens. The key takeaway from my research is that protest in conjunction with pressure inside of political and legal institutions is necessary to reduce racial violence. Now, this picture on this slide is a picture of the NAACP's, what they termed the silent protest parade. This was done in 1917 to protest violence and what they termed massacre of Black people in East St. Louis. And during this time, over 10,000 Black people marched down Fifth Ave in New York City. Up to this date, it is not the largest Black protest, but up to this date, it was in the United States. Now, historically, Black protest has served as a kind of testimony to the nation's most vulnerable in its ability to expose the bankruptcy of a country that has failed repeatedly in offering equal justice and equality for all of its citizens. All right, so again, my main focus is, at least my earlier research focuses on the first quarter of the 20th century and the NAACP's racial violence campaign. That, of course, is not the end of the Black freedom movement. It is not the end of civil rights scholarship. There's a tremendous amount of really important work that focuses on different aspects of protest, of especially Black protests in the 30s and the 40s, and of course in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, right? My purpose in kind of contextualizing a talk on protests and promises on the NAACP's campaign around racial violence is to say that this was really important in terms of the NAACP's campaign to the later kind of the heyday of the civil rights movement that would happen in the late 50s and of course the early 1960s. What you see on this slide is a picture of the March on Freedom, on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. What the NAACP's campaign around racial violence did is, one, it established the NAACP as a dominant, powerful organization that was able to have not just local and or state impact, but was able to have also national, federal impact as well. Right. And through the NAACP's, what would be their later win in Brown v. Board in 1954, that was also a key win to showing that the federal government, right, even if it didn't change everything on the ground for young Black kids going to school with white kids, that it was an important signal that they were not actually forgotten. It is also clear that the earlier campaign around racial violence, though it did not end, let's be clear, right? Because I want to come back to this in about five minutes. It did not end, that Black people across the South and as well as the North were enduring significant levels of racial violence still. It did in terms of at least decreased lynching and mob violence. Okay. What I have not yet talked about, as I promised at the beginning of this talk, is the role of philanthropy. And so one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, not just over the last 2 years, but over the last 8 years, has been about the agenda of different movements and how that shifts, as well as the strategies of different movements and why and how that shifts as well. But connected to that has been about the role of philanthropy in movements. So in terms of this kind of the earlier campaign around the NAACP, around racial violence, what of course happens in the 1960s is when I ask my students, like, how do you understand Black protests in this country? What are the main issues? They often, pretty much majority of my students, when I ask my students and I poll my class, say voting or education. Voting or education. And those are important issues, but what's interesting, of course, is that in the early 20th century, at least according to NAACP and other Black organizations at the time, it was really around racial violence. So the big question here is what happened? What happened? If this early focus at that time, one of the largest Black organizations in the United States, in which their main agenda item was racial violence, when we move forward, right, from the end of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, in which racial violence is no longer the main 1, 2, or 3 issue in the Black freedom movement, what happened? All right, so that's the question that been in the back of my mind for a long time. I'm gonna propose that part of what happened, not the complete story about what happened, but a significant part of understanding the shift in the agenda is connected to a funder through a process that I term movement capture. So in a recently published article, I developed the term movement capture as a way to understand the process by which well-meaning funders leverage their financial resources to apply pressure and influence the decision-making process of protest organizations, ultimately capturing these different movements. The movement capture framework hinges on the power imbalance between those that have resources and those that need them, and is more likely to happen during the earlier stages of movement formation. Now, an important point to underline is that this framework is useful for how we think about the invisibility of capture and how it is different from something, can be different from something like co-optation, which implies an explicit intention and power behind it. Movement capture calls our attention to the way power operates in spaces and between people where we would perhaps least expect it. The power of capture, I think, is that it does not require bad intentions or bad actors. In fact, it can seem natural. Now, movement capture seems to fit as a way of naming and articulating the tensions between a new cadre of wealthy donors and vibrant social movement activists in the past, as well as in the contemporary moment. So this is like a wordy slide. I'm going to apologize to all of you for that, but I understood my time constraints, and so I'm going to do a lot and run through a lot in the next 2 minutes right now, which is, so I kind of at least told you a story about the early civil rights movement in this country, the role of the NAACP. What's interesting is, right, that we oftentimes tell these stories about the NAACP and then civil rights organizations in the 1950s and the 1960s, and then most of them kind of go away. The NAACP is, of course, the oldest civil rights organization, is still around today, but other organizations, SCLC, SNCC, CORE, are not as strong and are no longer with us today. And so what happened, and we normally tell the story about what happened, is that there was leadership disagreements, people who are part of the organization go on to pursue different interests. We also tell a story about surveillance and infiltration by COINTELPRO. We rarely and or never tell a story about the role of foundations in the civil rights movement and of being part of the reason why some organizations are no longer around. So I'm gonna move through this very quickly, and I'm happy to go into more of this in terms of the Q&A. One, I think, important part of this story is why did the NAACP switch priorities, is that there was a radical white-led foundation called the Garland Fund that comes on board at the end of the 1920s and is really interested in this issue around education. And a very long story short, I documented through archival work of both the Garland Fund and the NAACP, a shift within the NAACP's leadership away from racial violence, in part because that is not necessarily where the Garland Fund wants to provide this big grant. Garland Fund wants to provide a big grant to go after the issue of education desegregation in the South through courts. The NAACP, as we know, of course, makes this like important history-making victory in Brown v. Board of Education. I argue in the article that I wrote about it that the story of collaboration and risk-taking has anchored left-leaning movement-oriented philanthropy as it demonstrates what is possible when donor supports a fledgling but ambitious movement. And as a result, the NAACP and the Garland Fund kind of partnership has become a North Star of social justice philanthropy, as it is the most successful example of civil rights funding that exists in the United States. No one asked the question that I obviously believe should be asked, which is, wait a minute, though, what happened to the focus on racial violence in the NAACP? And is there a way sometimes that funders get involved in protests in different types of movements and shift what could be the promise of what these movements and what these organizations can actually do? Also thinking about if we train our eye and we focus on the role of funders, specifically in the Black freedom movement, and we move, let's say, much kind of on, we focus on the role of funders in the 1960s. What's interesting there is that, of course, big philanthropy isn't the big philanthropy of today. It's much smaller, but it still is significant and has sway. There is a really interesting study done by Sean Dobson, and he concludes, and I'm just going to read from the slide here, the vast majority of the 12,000 foundations operating in the mid-20th century ignored our society's most obvious evil, though many of them had mission statements pledging to help the needy. The majority of their dollars went not to organizations seeking kind of structural institutional reform, but instead to groups seeking to soften in some ways racism's pernicious effects. Where kind of the big change in terms of the role of philanthropy is in 1965, with the Ford Foundation. Their new president, George Bundy, announced that he would turn the foundation's primary domestic focus to issues of what he called, quote unquote, Negro equality. The rash of urban uprisings the previous years, right, the long hot summer of 65 and 66, had played an instrumental role in for many, especially in terms of like liberal, sympathetic white people, that Black people needed to get out of the streets and perhaps more into politics and or into law. He also understood that addressing the demands of the Black freedom movement was key to addressing other areas of social change that the foundation was concerned with. However, under Bundy's guidance, the Ford Foundation sought to manage Black protests instead of learning from it, and instead of supporting it in the way that actually leaders wanted to be supported. The Ford Foundation looked to Black behavioral pathology rather than structural racism as a primary source of racial equality. At the end of the day, there's a really great work on this and a wonderful book by Karen Ferguson. But the legacy of the Ford Foundation's relationship to civil rights is complicated. It sought and succeeded in containing the radical edges of Black protests, but it did help to build up the infrastructure ultimately. The Ford Foundation pioneered the Community Development Corporation, CDC, a model that continues to predominate in public-private efforts to spur economic growth in especially Black communities. And other foundations also joined Ford's efforts, such as Carnegie and Rockefeller. But however, they continue to support a version of Black uplift and Black professionalization that was focused on Black capitalism, Black entrepreneurship, and litigations. Now, of course, again, I told you this is this double-edged sword. Incredible organizations such as MALDEF, right, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, were incubated at Ford. Now, in the wake of the civil rights movement, many of the biggest center and center-left foundations amassed an impressive set of wins: new people-powered organizations, the rise of public interest law, and a focus on poverty alleviation. Ford is a critical foundation to understand the building of the infrastructure of the left of center philanthropy. In so many ways, this brief time period shows what is possible, and philanthropy backs a big social change movement. Oh, let's go back one slide. We're almost done here. I'm going to be done in like 1 minute because I'm now over time. So now when we move forward from the 60s and the 70s, what is interesting, right? Again, if we train our focus right now to philanthropy, as well as this other issue about racial violence, what emerges in the 60s and 70s is not a focus on racial violence at all. And And so then what we see come out over the last 8-9 years in terms of what is happening in this country and the larger movement around Black lives, around police brutality, has so many kind of its earlier beginnings much earlier. And part of it comes from because we have not addressed so many problems of the past. Instead, they have been swept under the rug. And I think a lot of people have responsibility, a lot of people, a lot of institutions, a lot of different areas hold responsibility for that. Now, I think there's a number of lessons that we can take away. I think that today we are at a critical moment of organizing domestically and globally. Racial and ethnic minorities, environmental justice advocates, and groups focused on poverty are mobilizing and demanding to be heard. So what can we learn from this earlier period? What can we learn from Ida B. Wells? What can we learn from the NAACP? What can we learn from activists in the 60s and 70s? And what can we learn from courageous activists today who are a part of our communities? There's a lot, I think. I'm gonna stop here because I think I wanna go into some more of this in the Q&A, but I will end by, I think one of the biggest things that we can learn if we take it all together and don't treat what has happened over the last 2 years and over the last 8 years as an aberration from a normal functioning political system or in society, is to understand the longue durée, to understand the patterns and to understand the history. And I think then once you understand the longer history, that can better inform strategies for the present. I'll end there. Hi.
Thank you, Megan, for joining us and for that fascinating and really powerful presentation. So there's so much for me to digest, to chew on. And I'll start with one question that is based in the present moment, which draws on the events of last summer. So you mentioned that there were so many points you made that was so powerful, and I was frantically scribbling. But one point you mentioned was that there were only 10 days in 2021 where the police did not kill someone. And the two examples I'm going to raise right now are not necessarily related to police killings, but they are issues that are in the news right now. So in the case of the trial of Travis McMichael, Gregory McMichael, and William Bryan in the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, there was only one Black juror who was chosen in jury selection for that trial. And in the case of Kyle Rittenhouse, his trial opened with the lawyer saying the N-word in court, and the judge said that the men who were shot could be called rioters and looters, but not victims. So I'm wondering, with the protests that occurred last year, has there been a loss of momentum, or is it that we were talking to the people who were aligned and supportive? So help me fill in kind of where we were 2020, where we are today, which seems to be very much sort of usual.
Yeah, I think what you're touching on is it feels different where we are now than how it felt last summer. That in terms of, it seemed that there was a lot of attention. It seemed that momentum was building up, and it was much more than it actually is now. The way that I understand, so for me, that's actually not surprising, right? I know you're also kind of a student of the Black freedom movement as well. And kind of, if we look in terms of, I've had people, especially in terms of like funders being like, oh my goodness, I can't believe, what are the new polling right now, right? I did the whole kind of like public opinion today about support for abolition, about support for the Black Lives Matter movement are not at the levels of that they were last summer. A considerable drop from mostly white Democrats. Right, that you see kind of this spike in terms of especially white Democrat support, and then you see this like decline in 2021. We obviously also saw that in the Virginia governor race, right, this week. And so for me, in terms of, that's not a huge surprise. I find it disappointing. but the way that I understand that is that these different moments, early 20th century, and especially in terms of the 60s, so after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, after the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, there was a momentum around each of those, and then there were different types of, as the late 60s and early 70s, declines as well in terms of support. And so I think that happens in part because of what we know about race in American society. It's complicated, it's deep. And I think for many people, the capacity to hold the contradiction in who we say we are and in who we are and in who people see on their screen is really difficult. It's very difficult. And I think people's appetite to understand a type of transformation and commitment to change that isn't swift is also another level of difficulty, right? People want to understand, my students too, right? They want to understand a movement, a Black Lives Matter movement that is like a year, maybe 2 years. And after 2 years, if everything isn't great, then what happened? But part of me kind of starting with the NAACP, and why I always start with the NAACP in the early 20th century, is to say that we don't get Brown v. Board in 54 without the NAACP in 1911, in 1919, and 1923. We don't get the Civil Rights Act in 64 without Brown v. Board in 1954. The timeline is always long. It's never short, right? And so I don't like, there's no way where I'm like, oh my goodness, the Rittenhouse trial, that is okay. And like, we should be feeling good about that. No, we should be feeling pretty terrible about so much what is going on. We should feel mad that that momentum has dropped off, right? We should continue to still organize. That is still the work of right now. I do think that people are feeling, and that's natural to feel exhausted, and to have expected more from people in their neighborhoods, from people in their communities right now. I think that's only normal. But the way that I see this is like 2020 was a really important moment. And like we can continue to build on that and move forwards. But it is unlikely, even when I was in 2020, probably at a Carr Center presentation, that we were going to be able to maintain that because of what we know about race in American politics and society.
Thank you. So one of the things I think, we're aware of is the names of so many African-American men who have been killed by the police. Of course, it's not everyone, right? Because if there was at least one killing in over 355 days, but we know a handful of names that are in the news, in the spotlight, and they kind of resurface from time and time again. Eric Garner, of course, all the way up to George Floyd. But it's very, very rare that the names of African-American women are lifted up in the media or even in protests. And according to the African-American Policy Forum and their campaign, Say Her Name, Black women and girls as young as 7 and as old as 93 have been killed by the police. And knowing the names is necessary, but not a sufficient condition, of course, for justice. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are as we think about the ways in which we frame protests, speaking out, testimony, testifying. How do we think about equity around this issue?
Yeah, no, I think that this is really important. I love the work of Kimberly Crenshaw around this. This isn't my main in terms of research area. I mean, what I will say on this isn't the names that people tend to lift up right now, especially in terms of whether it is Ahmaud Arbery, whether it is George Floyd. Part of it is in terms of not being able to have a larger conversation about the different forms of violence, right? That it actually took, in terms of for George Floyd, for him to be murdered in daylight out there on the street, and for it to be taped, for people to be like, oh my goodness, this is crazy, we should actually do something about it. Now we know that the deaths in terms of the killings, the murders of Black women by law enforcement are often not as public, right? This is part of the issue in terms of why oftentimes they're not so much publicized and there isn't as much outrage around them, right? That they're done, it tends to be in private spaces, right? That Breonna Taylor, of course, before George Floyd was murdered in her home, right? And then George Floyd, obviously, in kind of the public murder of George Floyd and the private murder of Breonna Taylor. For me, in terms of the kind of the way that I think about in terms of talking to my students about this, is it shouldn't be just the public spectacle murders that make us upset, in which that there is something wrong, right? Like that's not what should trigger us to go to the streets. That's not what should trigger us to write our member of Congress. That's not what should trigger our outrage, right? In terms of when we go back to the mapping police violence, that police are killing in this way, full stop, full stop. That we should not have a police, this is the whole work in terms of abolition, in terms of reimagining, that we should not have a police force, law enforcement, that purports to keep us safe, that actually, especially for a specific group of people, doesn't keep them safe, right? And that should make all of us want to do something and want to change something. I actually think it's deeply problematic that people want to do something when things are so public. And that those tend to be the only times in which people are like, oh my gosh, that they're perfectly fine. This is one of the things, and that's why I'm like, people chose not to see things before, right? That it's these public things that then not force people, but then it's these public things that like guilt people, some people, into being like, oh my goodness, things are crazy. But things have been crazy for a very, very, very long time. The thing that I always say in some of these talks is that I just don't know when Black people have been safe. And that to me is a larger issue. Like that we live in a society in which policing and law enforcement for many Black communities has been the opposition force, has been a deadly force. And that I can't point you to a 10-year time span when I'm like, oh, you know what? Black people were safe. It just doesn't exist. It's like the end of the Civil War, Jim Crow, and then we have the 70s, and then we have the 80s and Reagan, and then we have the buildup of mass incarceration, and now? So you tell me when, and we're just all okay with that? Come on now. This is something that very much impacts Black men and very much impacts Black women as well.
So, it's interesting, your comment about sort of the capturing of, these modern day lynchings really on video or social media. And I think I'll just say two things. One is that, this sort of sharing and amplification of some of these videos, I actually find really deeply problematic in many instances where people almost revel in this sort of sharing of information digitally. But then on the flip side, I think I want to just call out, you may know her, Alyssa Richardson, who does research on how African Americans use mobile and social media to produce their own news networks. And her work explores the lives of Black citizen journalists. And she works on what she calls Black witnessing. And her book, which came out last year, is called Bearing Witness While Black, African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest Journalism. So, I think it is interesting to really think about this in the context of people who are working together to uplift and to hold, elected officials and police agencies and others accountable. And how best to support that, but without kind of falling into this trap of really kind of amplifying really disturbing images that really recall violence from decades past. So I know we are kind of running low on time, and I wanted to ask a couple questions from the audience and then close on a forward-looking, uplifting note. So one question from the audience is, how do you respond to people who blame, quote unquote, defund the police as a goal or slogan for the backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement?
Oh, okay. I'm like chuckling because that's normally how I respond. But this question does deserve a very serious, because this is something that is said a lot, passed around in the news, and it strikes me that it's so interesting because it's empirically incorrect, right? That in terms of there's like, if we look at what happened in 2020 around defund, around abolition, was key to organizing people. And in the organizing that happened, whether it's the 20 to 26 million people who took to the streets to protest what happens explicitly to George Floyd and or policing or the criminal punishment system, that it was also at these protests that people registered people to vote, that like it provided that defund and abolition, I think, are part of another story or narrative about how to create safer communities for people, right? How to imagine something different. Because if we're stuck with what we actually have right now, then kind of the ability for us to imagine ways in which people could actually be treated as full people, as complete citizens, is very, very, very limited. When you look at, especially in terms of, even if we just take the presidential election, as well as what happened in Georgia, defund and abolition are going to be significant to that, to the national election, in the sense of, as in a number of swing states, organizations, Black, Latino, AAPI, who were connected to defund and abolition, were key to registering people to vote and making the connection that, yes, we needed to organize, but we also need to vote for something new. And it's also the case, I mean, one of the other things, this is the other reason why I think that history is so crucial here, is that I also think I'm always reminded about campaigns to desegregate education, for Black people to vote, in which different members of Congress who supported integration, in which different members of Congress who supported different voting protections, and they received a lot of backlash. Yes, backlash will happen. There has been no radical move towards racial justice in this country in which there has not been backlash. That is the story of America. And so if not for defund and abolition, if we limited ourselves to what we have, and we prevented ourselves from being vocal about what our more radical visions are of the future, we wouldn't be where we are today, right? The only reason we have advanced is because of that. But yes, backlash will happen. That's inevitable. That's part of a bigger, better version of who we can be, right? And so, like, yes, there has been a little bit of backlash. In terms of the overall, like net change, I think, has been really positive in so many different ways that are sometimes hard to measure.
So another question from the audience: how can donors and philanthropy help without capturing the priorities of the Black freedom movement?
That's a difficult one. That's like multi-pronged.
Well, if you'd like, I could start with a couple of ideas off the top of my head. I think one is listening to groups on the ground without dictating agendas, ensuring funding is multi-year, not necessarily sort of, a lot of times funding is given with, lots of strings attached, no overhead, or it's like 1 year and then it kind of goes away, or it's a window dressing. There's a lot of things that could be done to, shift the power, but these conversations have been happening in philanthropy for decades. So, it's not like a new conversation, but there seems to be this collective amnesia, right? Charles Mills talks about this sort of like amnesia that exists. Yes, and so I wonder whether, that can actually happen or not.
Yeah, I mean, I always pause on this question because I actually kind of began, after I wrote this article about movement capture, I spoke a bit about like, these are the different ways in which funders can perhaps like prevent capture. And I now believe that capture will always happen, actually, when you have funders and grantees, in part because of the power dynamic that is always there. And so I think the key thing for those who are working in the funder world need to think about is how do you lessen capture, right? Because like one of the things that like right now like drives me insane is when funders try to act like that there isn't a power dynamic, right? That they can be partners. Partners is one of the things that people love to say. And it's like, can you really be partners if you have billions and the other person on the end of this exchange like needs your money to do what the important work that they are actually doing? And so I think it's key to think about what are different strategies to lessen capture. And I think that there are a number of different strategies. I think in terms of one I've been talking about a lot more recently is changing the way that a lot of center and left funders actually do evaluation and measure impact. I think that there's many people have been operating off of a specific type of evaluation and impact. And if you actually care about movements, then you're going to need a different kind of evaluation metrics as well as impact. This is not service delivery. Like I sometimes say, in 2016, and if you were a funder that funded an organization connected with the Black Lives Matter movement, how would you show success? In 2020, everybody was like, yes, it's success, right? But in 2017, in 2018, in 2019, people were like, what is this ragtag group of individuals? What do they do besides getting mad on social media? And they were building, right? But if you understand movements and you understand the timeline needs to be much longer and you can't evaluate impact in the traditional ways that a lot of center and left funders evaluate impact. I think the other key, and this is big, is I feel like there's been a lot of talk about this, is like unrestricted grants long-term. And I don't mean 2 to 5 years. I mean 10, 20, 30 years for grant making. I think like that is key. I think being honest also for funders and being transparent about grant making practices. Even some of my favorite funders on the left, there's not a lot of transparency. And I think that actually needs to be the case. The other thing is that, and this is where I'll end on this question, which is, I don't think for a number of organizations who want to lessen funders, who want to lessen capture and fund movements, I'm talking here about movements, not service delivery organizations, but movements, they really need to be clear about funding the inputs. People, center and left funders, especially 2020 and post 2020, love to fund the inputs, love to fund leaders, splashy, they can throw it across their web pages, right? But they don't do enough to fund the opposition. You can't just fund the inputs. You have to know that otherwise the incredible leaders and the wins that they are accruing will lessen if you do not fund to defund the opposition or do anything about the opposition, right? Because there is an opposition to racial justice. There absolutely is. We have seen them be active, but a lot of left and center funders pretend or like to convince themselves that there is not an opposition, and there absolutely is. The easiest way to understand this, and I don't always like to do this, but to use the conservative legal movement as an example, that part of it was like, how do we fund ideas and how do we fund up the movement and like invest in leaders and leadership development? Yes, but it's also about how do we also weaken the opposition? If you don't weaken the opposition, you're going to be in trouble. And the center and center left funders around movement building right now are not doing enough to weaken the opposition because they can't put it on their webpage and because they have to stake an ideological position. And funding movements is almost impossible to do well if you do not stake an ideological position. And that's not what center and left funders want to hear.
So I'll ask you one last question before we wrap up, which draws on something you raised in the early parts of your presentation, where you said, who do we want to be? So we kind of diagnosed the issues and the fact that, this is who we are. It's not exactly how people say, well, this is not who we are. This is who we are, and it draws on a historical legacy, but who do we want to be? And how do we
This is something, like part of me posing it in this way is because I never actually really thought about that. It's so much of how I have been in terms of my positionality has been like fighting against things and like in opposition to, right? Like not in terms of having the space to dream about a different type of world, about who do we want to be. It's that I don't want the police in our communities. It's that I want healthcare for people, right? I want us to be a place in which like Black Lives Matter, in which I don't have to say that, and that to be like a radical statement. I want us to embrace the radical vision of especially Indigenous feminists of another generation who, and that's part of in terms of what a lot of the abolition organizing builds on, as well as Black freedom fighters in the early 20th century. I mean, part of who we are right now is because we're on a certain course, but at different moments in American politics, there have been different paths that have then been closed off. And so I want us to be a place in which that everyone has a roof over their head, that people are not fearful, right, of for example, of law enforcement, that people have healthcare. I just don't think that like, somehow these have become controversial things. It's bizarre to me, right? Like that part of what I do. Oh, and I want us to be a place in which there's not billionaires and people who have nothing, right? Like there's just a lot of things that I would like to see structurally different. And while it may not happen in my lifetime, I believe that it can still happen. And I believe, to close out on the title of this talk, that I think through protest, that promise is possible.
Oh, that's a great way to wrap up our conversation. And I'll just say, quoting Ella Baker, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes." So we keep on keeping on. Thank you, Megan, for joining us today.